Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of What's New in Prisma. I'm Nicholas Burke and I'm here with my colleague Ryan Schenke. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well here. How about you?
I'm doing great as well. We had a really exciting week over here at Prisma with a big launch of Prisma Migrate that we finally launched, ready for production for everybody to use. So I'm really looking forward that from now on, the kind of questions that we occasionally get when people or like the concerns that people raise that how am I supposed to use Prisma without a proper migration system being ready for me?
Right.
That's really something that I expect from my ORM, was really a concern that has been raised like fairly often.
Yep.
And now we finally have a proper response to that because Prisma Migrate is now generally available. And we'll, of course, talk about that later in the stream. We actually invited people who directly worked on Migrate on the stream today, and that's Tom and Daniel, who are going to walk us through. But of course, we'll also talk about the release in general that happened on Tuesday. So there are a couple of more features that are interesting. And we have another use case for a Prisma generator. So we've talked about these generators already a couple of times in the past here on the stream as well. Talked about a couple of use cases. And today there's another really interesting use case, I think, that pairs Prisma with AWS Appsync. But that's all I want to say for now. And I think with that, Ryan, we can start talking about the release.
Let's talk about it. I am going to pop my screen open here. You let me know if you can see the GitHub release here.
Yes, it's visible.
Perfect. So 2.19 is here, landed on Tuesday. And what do we get with it? The big news, as Niko alluded to, is Prisma Migrate now in GA. So this is really exciting because it rounds out this kind of product or kind of feature set that you might want for full production readiness for usage of Prisma in your projects. And now you get everything without the preview feature flag. So that is big news. I guess the change, the ergonomics that have changed for you at this release are basically you drop the preview feature flag that you would append to your commands when you're running like npx Prisma Migrate. You can drop this now. And beyond that, there are a couple things that have been fixed, made better. I'll let you read through the documentation and the release notes to get a sense of what has changed. And Daniel, I believe, will talk a bit more about those specifics a bit later. But this is the big thing. We now have Prisma Migrate in GA, so that is very exciting. That's the big thing for the 2.19 release. We have a new feature, I guess, or an adjustment to a feature, you could call it, that has also come along, which is when you order by relations in your Prisma client queries, you can now do it on aggregates. So you could take two models that were related. You could then order by the related model, kind of like take one of the fields in ascending or descending fashion, that kind of thing. But now you can do it with aggregates. So the example here is like if you've got users who have posts. So like you have users and they have many posts. Now you can get your ordered user results back based on the count, for example, of the posts that each user has. So you can do like aggregations in the related model, and then you can pull your base model results out based on that ordering. So it's grouped in with like the already existing order by relation preview feature. So it's an opt-in. So in your client, in your generator here, you would opt in via preview features, add the order by relation to your preview features array, and you will get that. That is the big news. Those two items from the 2.19 release. We also have an update to the Go clients. The transaction API now will return results. I guess before you could only write data, but now you will get the results back from a transaction. That is new in the Go client. Other fixes and improvements are listed below. You can have a look at the release notes with the 2.19 tag, and you can have a look through all of these things that have been changed and fixed, etc. that is that. I figure, unless, Niko, you have some comments about the release notes here, I can jump into a little demo of this order by aggregates and relations. But what do you think? Do you have any thoughts on the release?
Let's see what the order by relations looks like in practice. I'm really looking forward to your demo here.
Cool. So I have got a little workspace set up. I've got this schema here where I have authors and I've got posts. And an author has many posts like this, right? And then a post has a single author. So these two are related. And I can get the order by relation feature here if I opt into it, like I said, with preview features. So I just pass order by relation to the preview features array, and I have access. So what this means is now if I want to get these results for authors ordered by the count, so the aggregate of the related post field, I can do that. So ordered authors equals await Prisma author find many. And when I go to find many, I will order by, I'm just going to pull this over so people can see. So I will order by posts. And when I do this order by, I will say count in an ascending fashion to start with. So we'll do console.log ordered authors. Now let's see what we get. npm run dev should spin it up. There is the ordering. So we get the author with ID 2 coming first, then 3, then 1. What if we flip it? Descending fashion here. We get a different order. And so what's happening is these authors all have different numbers of posts attributed to them. I wonder if we can see this. npx Prisma Studio.
Yeah, in Prisma Studio, it should be highlighted even in the author table that you view. I think like that's one of the nice things of Prisma Studio, that it shows you the count of relations, I think, already initially.
Absolutely. And so let's do this. I'm going to flip over here and pop Prisma Studio in. Hopefully you can see this, Niko.
Yes, if you increase it a little bit, yeah, perfect.
So there we go. We have John Doe with the most posts, and me coming in at number 2, and then Jane Doe has the fewest. So if we have, what do we get here? If we flip back over to the initial terminal that we had. So we get John, then me, then Jane. So that looks good for descending. And again, for ascending, you would have it the other way around. So that is how that works. So you take the aggregate of the related field. You can now order by that relation, and you can do so. That means you can do even more with the way you would order your results. So that should come in handy. And I think that's about all there is to say on this feature for now. So with that, maybe I will hand it back over to you, and we can sort of introduce Daniel and Tom to the stream.
Yeah, let's add them. Let's shuffle around here the screen a little bit. That's the screen share version. That's the right version. I'll take care of arranging things.
Yeah.
Hey, Daniel and Tom.
Hello.
Hey, everyone.
How's it going?
We're doing great. Tom, I think you have been involved with Prisma Migrate from the very start. You're a software engineer here at Prisma, and you're on the Rust team. So specifically kind of working on the Rust side of things. And I think for you specifically, it must have been a really big launch this week, because you joined us. Like, when did you actually join us? Is it already a year or 1.5 years ago?
Yeah, more like 1.5, September 2019.
All right, yeah. So 1.5 years ago. And you started working on Prisma Migrate back then pretty much by yourself, right? You were the first person that kind of maintained and developed the Prisma Migrate experimental version up until we kind of professionalized our approach. We built a product team around it, added more engineers, and here we are, the final week with the general availability launch. How do you feel, Tom?
I'm kind of optimistic about what's coming next, because we had like a lot of work like in the past year, especially with building the team and reimagining things and like coming up with all the concepts that we have today. But in the past month, actually, we kept improving things, but we didn't completely reimagine the tool, which feels very good. And especially the release this week was for us, kind of boring in a very, very good way, in the sense that nothing was on fire and the tool was working. I mean, it's not bug free, nothing is, but it's pretty stable, and we just released it. And from the engineering perspective, it was kind of boring in a very, very good way. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah. Boring releases are the best releases.
Yes.
And like for the folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about kind of the process, how we built like Prisma Migrate, we actually had Alberto, the product manager of the Migrate team, on this live stream here as well a couple of months ago. I think it actually was during the holiday special right before Christmas. So that must have been version 2.14 or something. So if you're curious as to that entire process, then it's certainly worth going back to that particular episode and listening to what Alberto had to say about the process. All right. I think, Daniel, you prepared a demo that you and Tom wanted to show us. So I think without much further ado, we can just hand over the screen to you, and you just walk us through what the current version of Prisma Migrate actually looks like.
Yeah, sounds good. We've prepared a couple of little items and workflows that we want to demonstrate. I'm going to bring up my screen onto the stream. And I believe we could swap that. I think that's right. Okay, yes. So there's a couple of things that I want to show that I think are really relevant. And as you can probably see, I have a Prisma schema here. And this is the same schema that I used for the real world grading app. This was a series that we made last year. It was a 4-part series where we talked about building a schema and then building all the way up to a REST API that is deployed with a CI and CD pipeline. And so there's a couple of things that we want to show today. And then the first one is the happy path with Prisma Migrate. So assuming that you're starting out, you already have a rough idea of what you want your database schema to look like, and you've created your Prisma schema. And now comes the moment when you want to actually create the database schema. And so I've already created this Prisma schema here, and I'll quickly go over it. So we have a bunch of models here. The main sort of, usually these kinds of schemas, have a user model that has a lot of different relations. So in this case, this schema is for a grading application. So an application that is used to grade the results of different students in courses. And so for that, we have this user model. We have a token model that is used for authentication. We have a course model, and each one of these courses can have multiple enrollments. These can be either students or teachers who are enrolled in this course as a teacher. And then each one of these courses can have multiple tests. And then for each test, you can have multiple results that are linked to the teacher who graded it and also the student who actually sat the test. And so I've created this. It's all nice and good. And now we want to create the schema. And so I have no migrations. I haven't created the database yet, but I have already configured in my environment variables. I've already configured here the database URL to my local development database. And so typically, if you're starting out like this, then the first thing that you would probably want to do in order to get started is use this dbpush command. And this dbpush command is responsible for creating the database schema without any migrations. And as we can see, it successfully created the database and it's now in sync with the schema. And so if I open up just the CLI to see what's going on in my database, I can actually list the different tables, and you can see that I have all of these different tables that map to the different models that we have in the schema, in the Prisma schema, that is. So that was all good. But now comes sort of the moment when, okay, I want to actually create a migration and see the SQL so that I can actually deploy that in different environments. And so to do that, this is the moment when you would use the Prisma Migrate dev command. And this command, what it will do is it'll look at this schema, and instead of just directly creating the database schema in Postgres, it'll actually create the SQL and then run it. Does that make sense so far, Tom? Am I making sense? Yeah?
Yeah, that's absolutely it.
Okay, great.
So to recap, the main difference between Prisma-DB push and the migrate dev command is basically that Prisma-DB push will not generate these migration files and not store them on the file system for me, but only apply my current Prisma schema to the database. And with migrate dev, I actually get these migration files to track my migration history, so to say.
Yeah, and of course, it's important to mention that they have different purposes. I mean, if you're quickly prototyping and you want to try out different ideas, then DB push is a much easier way to do that. And then once you're sort of ready to like take your work and actually apply that to a testing or a staging or even a production environment, that's when you would start using the migrations. And so they fit into the workflow, but just at different stages. And so now I ran this Prisma migrate dev. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. And so I ran this, let me just run it again so we have a clean terminal here. So I'm running the migrate dev command, and it's detecting drift. Basically, it's saying that it's not in sync with my migration history, and that is because I already created the database with the db push command. And so I will tell it, yes, please reset my database. Oh, and we already get the first error. Okay, let's see.
I tried to run the seeding, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes, that's the seeding.
So let's try again. Yeah, okay, so now it's asking me to name the migration, and I'm just going to name this init. And so, okay, now it created this migration file, and we can take a look at that. And so here in this migrations folder, I have this init migration, and if I open it up, we see that we have the enums that were created, and then all of these different tables that are created using the SQL. So that's all good. And if I go back to the database, I can list again, and as you can see, I have all of these different tables, and I also have this additional Prisma migrations table. And this is the way that Prisma Migrate keeps track of what migrations you've already executed against your database. And so when you're using Migrate, you will always have this Prisma migrations table that is responsible for making sure that everything runs smoothly, and that you can keep track of which migrations have been applied and haven't been applied. So that was sort of the very first path. We created the migration. Now I think it's a good moment to actually run the seed command. So I'm going to run npx prisma db seed. Now this is still a preview feature, so you need to add the preview feature flag. And once I run this, I can open up Prisma Studio and have a look at some of the data that has been filled in the database. And I'll make that a little bit bigger. And as you can see here, I have the user model, and I have all of these fields, and we can navigate and see all of the different relations, like the test results. And this student was, this user was a teacher of this specific course. And we can also look at the different courses. And so we created this one course, and we have these two users who are enrolled as students and one as a teacher. Okay, so that was the first part, and this is basically the way that Prisma creates these migrations, and that's the happy path. It creates the SQL for you, and it executes it when you're running in development. Now, I think it's a good moment for us to move on and then look at what it would look like when we want to now continue evolving this schema, and how that applies in the context of having multiple environments. Now, this project that this real-world grading app is also deployed to Heroku. And so I'm going to actually show how that all happens. I'll open up the real-world grading app. And so this is where I have it. I'm using here GitHub Actions in order to deploy the changes. So this is already, it already has the first migration deployed in production. And I will go back to master. And if I look here, I'm just going to clean this migration that we created because we don't need it. And if we look on master, and you can also see this here, we have already this initial migration. So in the first part, I was just demonstrating how that's created. But now that we have that created, we want to continue evolving this schema that we have. And so I'm going to create a new branch, and I'm going to call it add feedback. And now I have this branch, and I still have, of course, in the Prisma migrations folder, of course, I have this initial migration that has already been executed against my production environment. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the Prisma schema. And I'm going to go ahead and actually add a new model to this schema. And this new model is going to be called course feedback. So model course feedback, and it's going to have an ID field, which is auto incremented, and we will also want to gather feedback. That's going to be a string. We could also use the native types here to define a certain length. I'll keep it as a text for now. And then I need, of course, the relation field. So I want the feedback to be linked to a specific course and to be given by a specific student. So we need two relations here. One is going to be to the student, and for that, I'm going to store it as a student ID. And then the next one will be the course ID, which is also an int. And then, of course, we need the actual, I think we call this the relation, the virtual relation field.
Relation fields, yeah.
So this is going to be of type user, and I'm going to define the relation here. So the fields, student ID, and it references the ID field. And we also have that for course, and that's a course, and it's going to be course ID. And of course, I got that wrong, so that has to be capitalized.
Yep.
And what we can see is we can already see that it automatically added the back relation field. So I'm going to rename this just to feedback for simplicity, and then also this to feedback. Okay, cool. So now I created this model, and now I'm ready for Prisma Migrate to create the migration for me. And so again, I'm using the npx Prisma Migrate dev command. And what that will do is it'll create the SQL and execute it. Now, of course, it detected that there was drift because we changed branches and so on. And so it's all good. We're going to reset the database. And now it's applied the seed because it reset the database. And so we want to make sure that the development database always has data. And that's why when it resets the database, it runs the seed again. And now it's asking me to name this migration. I'm going to call it add feedback. And there we go. Okay, so this has been applied. And of course, we can always use the Prisma Migrate status command, which will tell us what is the status of our database in comparison to, in relation to the migrations that we've created. And indeed, the two migrations were found, and the schema, the database's schema is up to date. So let's just take a quick look at the migration that was generated, and it's pretty trivial. It creates a new table. We didn't make any change to any of the existing models, so this is a pretty obvious change that we're making. I think now is a good moment to also update our seed script. So we have a seed script, and we might wanna, and this seed script just creates, it creates a user, and it creates a course, and it creates two users who are then enrolled as students in the course that we created. And now I want to create some feedback. So feedback 1, which will be created by course feedback.create, and let's see. And then here I want to give it interesting course, looking forward to learning more. Now I'm going to link it to the user that we created. Let's see. Yeah, let's link it first to the course, and we're going to connect that to the course that we've already created. Thanks to all the type safety, this is quite easy.
Yeah, it's like so nice to see the auto completion at work every time. I'm just amazed.
So here we can take ID and then take David and take his ID. And so now I'm going to run this seed script again. And okay, now if I open up the studio again, and we should be able to see the data that we created. Let's see, we already have the feedback here, and then we can see this is the record that I created. We can also look at it from the course feedback. So this is basically the workflow for creating it. Now that I've done it locally, I want to actually show what it looks like to create a pull request out of this and see what it looks like when I'm deploying this to production. This is when it gets really, I think, interesting. And this is also when a lot of the interesting questions come up. So let's go back to our terminal. And the next step would be to actually add the migration that we created into the branch to make a commit with that. So if I do a git status, I'm going to actually add the change to the Prisma schema, also the change to the seed script, and I'm going to add these migrations. Now we also have this migration log file. Do you want to speak to that, Tom, maybe?
Yes, I mean, it's a very kind of straightforward feature. There's nothing to be scared of. It's simply a file we write to your migrations folder, and that tells to migrate what the connector is for these migrations. So you don't try to apply Postgres on migrations on SQLite, for example. That wouldn't work. So if you try to do that, we'll detect it, and then you have a nice message. It tells you, okay, you're trying to do that, doesn't work, here's how to fix it. There's really nothing more to it.
And the reason for this is so that we prevent, if I understand correctly, the reasoning behind this is to prevent, because there's a lot of database incompatibilities, this prevents us from hitting, if you're, say, using locally SQLite and then in production Postgres, because of the differences between them, we might encounter errors. Yes,
maybe some very simple migrations can be made to work on both, but in general, it's just not possible. So we just guard you against it because it's not going to work, basically. There are ways if you want to deploy to multiple databases, if you want to maintain multiple migrations history, for example. Mm-hmm. But yeah, having one set of SQL migrations specifically for multiple databases is not something that works.
So this is sort of preventing a lot of errors. Okay, so I'm committing now all of these changes, and I'm gonna push them to my branch. And now it's created this. Now I'm gonna actually go ahead and create a pull request for this. And I can do that directly from the CLI because I have the GitHub CLI, but this is just a matter of preference. And so that's that. And I got the URL. Let's open up this pull request. Now, the reason that I'm running this pull request is because I have tests, integration tests. So this is a REST API that uses Prisma in order to serve a lot of different endpoints. I can also run this obviously locally, but if I'm collaborating on a project, it's quite important, for my colleagues to be able to see some of these changes and to be sure that these migrations can be executed and that the tests pass. And so now that I'm pushing it, I can maybe show quickly a little bit of what the workflow, the GitHub Actions workflow does. So here the test, what it does, it creates this Postgres service container. And then the steps that it runs is it, of course, installs the dependencies. It runs the build in order to compile the TypeScript. It runs the DB push, and then it runs the tests. Now, I think theoretically we can already change that to use migrate deploy to make sure that it's actually running the migrations. That would probably be a better approach. So just a heads up about that. And then it'll run the tests. And if the tests fail, we'll get the build will fail. And so we can already see that the tests have been run here. And we're using Jest here. And these are real tests that are injecting requests that end up going to the database during the build process. Great, so my tests passed, and now I'm ready to merge this pull request. And once I merge it, then our master branch will build this and deploy it. And this is deployed to Heroku. So when it comes to deploying production migrations, there's a lot of different nuances that depend on the platform that you're deploying to. And for Heroku, one of the important parts is to define this proc file. And so Heroku has this feature called the release phase, which you can read about. I can drop a link to that. And what this release phase is is it allows you to run any arbitrary command just before the new deployment goes live. And so in this case, we're running npx Prisma-Migrate deploy during this release phase, which will ensure that the migration runs before the new version is deployed. So let's have a look at what's happening here in our GitHub Actions. And we can see this is the master branch. This is the one that's going to also run the deploy step once the tests pass. And we can already, I think.
Yeah, this always takes some time.
Now I'm going to open up the logs, and these are the logs for the application. I can also just make a dummy request to the API. And we can see that the request will come in soon. Yeah, there we go. So if you're using the Heroku free plan, it actually idles your application if it's not accepting requests. But here we see that we got this profile request. So this is the deployed, this is the production app. Let's see. Okay, so now the deploy phase is running. And we will probably also see this in the logs. There we go. A build was started.
Looking at CI.
Yeah.
One of my favorite pastimes. Yeah. That's part of the shared experience of developers, I think.
Yeah, day in the life of the developer is, I think, includes at least 5% of the time waiting for the CI server to run.
Yeah, any minute now it's going to be green. Yeah.
Let's see if we see anything in the logs already.
Maybe a quick reminder for folks at this point that if you have any questions about how Prisma-Migrate works, or about any other aspect that you're curious about Prisma, then you can drop them in the chat, of course, and we'll pick them up and respond to the best of our knowledge.
Yes, and in general, if you have comments or questions or feedbacks or criticism about Migrate, really do talk to us. We read all the feedback. For example, on the Slack, Prisma Slack, public Slack, or in the GitHub issues, we really do read and discuss all of the feedback. So yeah, it's something we really love to have. So don't be scared to ask questions or talk to us.
Okay, so basically in the logs, what I can see is that after the deploy happened, it ran this npx Prisma migrate deploy that we had defined in our proc file. And we can see that 2 migrations have been found, and then the following migration has been applied, the add feedback. And then it happened successfully, and now the application is running. And I also have the Postgres CLI open here. And this is open against the production database. And as you can see, if we look at the schema, we also have this course feedback table that we created. And I think I need to add quotes. And there we go. We have the feedback and then the 2 foreign keys. So that was pretty much it in terms of deploying a migration. There's also this status command that in the case of Heroku, we can also run it against our production using Heroku run. So this will run a command in the Heroku environment. And if we run migrate status, we can also verify with this that the migration has been successfully executed. So this is basically to wrap up the whole CI/CD topic. And then there's one more thing, I don't know if we have time, that I would love to show, and this is the expand and contract pattern.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, great, cool. So let's start with what is the expand and contract? And do you want to speak to that, Tom, or do you want me to go into it?
Yeah, I can give a very quick explanation. Basically, expand and contract is a way to break up a change to your schema. So say you want to change the name of a field. This change can be completely trivial. If you don't have lots of code relying on it, you're okay with a bit of downtime, you can just rename the thing. It's going to do the alter table and then it's going to work. But fundamentally, when you do a breaking change like that in your schema, you're going to have some downtime because the code before the schema change and the code after the schema change are kind of incompatible. They don't expect the field to have the same name. So you're going to have some time where your old code doesn't work, or some time where your new code doesn't work when you deploy. And the more data you have, the more time is going to take for the migration to run in the database, and so the longer this downtime is going to be. So if you look at how organizations that have huge databases like GitHub run migrations, they always use this pattern where you have to do things in 2 migrations. Basically, you first add the new thing that you're going to use. Then you can deploy your code that uses the new thing, but you still have the old thing in your schema, in your database. So the old code continues working. Then you deploy your code, and then progressively you remove what uses the code that uses the old APIs or the old database fields and all that. And once you don't need the old thing anymore, you can have a migration that drops it. And that way you can have migrations without breaking any code and without any downtime. The only downside of that is, of course, it's more effort. You have to do that over several deployments and several migrations. So it's more effort, but I think it's worth, even if you don't have that big of a scale, if you have an app that's deployed, it's worth getting used to doing it because it's just a nicer way to work, and it's a way to have kind of fearless deployments. If you know both your old code and your new code work with your database schema before and after the migration, then you're not worried about your deployment because you know, like, even if my old code has a problem, I roll back my code and the old code still works because we didn't rename the field, we added a new one that we're going to use later. I hope I'm clear.
That totally
in
makes sense.
explaining
And in case it didn't, don't worry, because we're going to demo it. So in many ways, this seems similar to how you would handle deprecated field in the GraphQL schema. I suppose so, yeah. Let's take what we have and build on that and create a slightly contrived scenario, but definitely an example that showcases how you would do this. So assuming that we have this last name field in our model, in our user model, and we want to rename that to surname. I grew up in Australia, so I'm really used to surname, but you know, for the purposes of being more universally applicable, I've gotten used to last name. And so now we want to rename this field, but if we rename that, a lot of the existing code might start failing. And so what we're going to do is, I'm going to show how to do this expand and contract pattern, but the sort of high level idea, as Tom sort of alluded to, is that you do an additive change and then later on you actually do the removal of the last name field. So the first step that we're going to take here in order to rename the last name field to surname is we're going to create a new one. And for now we can add a note, and then we can add the surname here. Now I have pulled the changes that I've merged in the pull request, and now I'm going to create a new branch called rename last name. And now that I'm in this branch, I've already made this change, and now I can run migrate dev. But in this case, I'm going to run a special version of migrate dev, and that is using this create only flag. What this create only flag will do is it will create the SQL migration, but it won't apply it. So I'm going to go ahead with that. And I'm going to call add surname. And of course it hasn't been applied, but it tells me whenever I'm ready to apply it, I can go ahead and do that. And if I go back to the code and I look at this migration, I have this migration here and it alters and it adds the column, but this isn't very useful. I want to actually have, I want to do a rename, and I want to do that incrementally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this update SQL statement, which will copy over all of the data that is in the last name column to the surname. So that way we can then update our code base to make use of the surname instead of last name. So now that I've saved this migration, I can go ahead and run it simply using the dev command. And there we go, it's been applied. And now if we open up Prisma Studio, we should be able to see all of the data. I'm going to move that over here, and I'm going to go to the user model. And as we can see, we have the last name and then the surname, and they're exactly the same because it's been copied over. So that was the first step of doing this. We've ran the migration, we looked at the things, and now comes the sort of the next step. And I'm not going to actually fully demonstrate this, but the idea would be now that you would actually change your code base to make use of surname. So if I do a search in my code base for last name, I can see, for example, in the seed script that I'm using this last name here, and I want to make sure that my code base only makes use of surname. And there's a really nice feature in Prisma that was introduced recently that can really help you with these kinds of migration and doing this expand and contract pattern. And to do that, so this feature that I'm going to show you is called this @ignore attribute. @ignore, what it's responsible, it has a bunch of different use cases, but in this case, we're going to use it so that any field that is annotated with this @ignore will not be surfaced in Prisma client. So if I add this @ignore, nothing will change in the database schema. Prisma Migrate won't change anything in terms of creating migrations, but when you generate Prisma client, you won't be able to use the last name field. And the reason that I want to do this is because I want to get all of the type errors from Prisma client from my use of last name. So this is a really convenient way to get all of those errors. And so now that I've added this @ignore, I can run npx prisma generate, and suddenly all of the places in my code base where I'm using last name will get a type error. And let's have a look at that. Let's just start with the seed script. And we can already see we've got the red squiggly lines, and the reason that we have them is because it's not assignable to the type. But if I change that to surname, as you can see, it passes it. And so now I can run Prisma db seed, and my seed script will succeed in writing those. Oh, okay. You're trying to, oh, right. Yeah, I think that's because I still have the course feedback that I need to delete.
Ah, yes.
Okay, the change you're trying to make. Oh.
So that's a client error.
Yeah, let's see. Which line is that? From 13. Oh, I think it's due to the order of the deletions.
Yes.
Right.
In my seed script. There we go.
Nice.
Yes, that was it.
So now if I open up Prisma Studio, we can see that basically, well, the database has been reset, but we can see that now the surname is the one that is being used, and we can't even see last name. So that was a sort of a very like quick and dirty way to demonstrate what the expand and contract pattern is. But the idea is it's similar to the strangler pattern. Essentially, you are introducing incremental changes, and only once you're confident that your code isn't making use of any fields that are about to be deprecated, only then do you actually remove. And so the final step in this would be to actually go ahead, remove last name from the Prisma schema, and then run a migration that will delete the column from the database schema. So that's pretty much it from my side. But
is there anything in Prisma Migrate that, or maybe it doesn't exist yet, might it exist in the future that helps with cases where you want to like copy the contents of one field over to another one? Or is it always the case, do you think, that we'll have to like amend the generated SQL file? I don't know if that's a feature of any migration systems, but it seems like a common use case, right? I need to create a new field. I need to copy data from another field, or maybe like even aggregate data from a couple fields or something like that. Is that always left up to SQL?
So I don't know of any other migration tool that does that. It also completely depends on the amount of data. Like if you have huge tables, like it's going to take days literally to do that change. So and it's going to be like much longer if you do it in JavaScript instead of in SQL. But we're definitely seeing that as an interesting area where if we can do something that makes people's lives easier, we'll do it. But we haven't worked on it yet.
Gotcha. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, that like with giant tables, it takes a long time to do these kinds of things. I remember reading about, I think it was Craigslist that ran into this issue. They have like ginormous data sets, and they were taking days to like, rename fields, for example. And that was, I think I remember reading this in the context of an argument for why you might want to use MongoDB, because you just add the field instead of.
Yeah. I've talked with some people who work on MySQL and like very large scale deployments for MySQL. And in one case, I think it's like the very worst case, but there's one migration that took like 4 months to run.
Seriously.
Of course, they run in the background. You don't have downtime.
Yeah.
But like something like GitHub, like it can take easily days to migrate a field.
Wow.
An network table. So you have to plan around it, and of course the workflows are different. The way we build Migrate is for like productivity. When you have an app that you're not GitHub, we might build that later, but we build for productivity. So we don't have all the features to migrate huge tables yet.
Interesting. Thanks for the demo there, Daniel. That was really good.
Yeah,
I liked it.
that was
Amazing.
really, really insightful, very extensive. And the good thing also is that we're adding timestamps to these videos. So I think in the future, we'll also be able to kind of reference back to this particular part of the video for people who are interested in seeing a live version of the expand and contract pattern. To wrap up Prisma Migrate, I think it's worth mentioning that we've written a ton of documentation for various kind of migration workflows. In fact, it was mostly our colleague Martina, who also already was on the stream a couple of weeks ago, who was responsible for this. So if you have any questions, if you want to learn about specific workflows, then definitely go ahead and check out the documentation. And with that, I think we can leave Daniel and Tom go, and see you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for
See you
joining.
around.
Bye. All right. I'm rearranging the screen. There we go. All right. That was super exciting, and I really, really enjoyed the demo. Very in-depth and a good overview of all the relevant workflows. I think that was a really good introduction for folks that haven't used Migrate yet.
Absolutely. Yep. That was really good. Do we have time to show what you wanted to show? We got a full demo from you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. We'll probably run a little bit over the hour today, but I hope that's fine. And the demo that I'm going to show today is with Prisma and AWS AppSync. Have you used AppSync in the past already, Ryan?
No, I have not. This is something that I want to look into, though, because I'm hearing all sorts of great things, mostly from Nader Dabit. I see him talking about it all the time on Twitter. So I got to check it out. And this will be the reason that I start to use it, is after seeing what you do with it here. I'm excited to see what you do with it.
All right, I am sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah, you can see the infinite loop. Let me do that again. That was the wrong one. This one. Now you're seeing the terminal, and now you're seeing the page of the Prisma-Appsync generator. So as a quick introduction, what even is AWS AppSync? I think on a very high level, you can imagine it as somewhat as a backend as a service, where you don't have to worry about kind of implementing your own GraphQL server. You're not specifically writing any code. In the very easiest case, you would just define a data model. In this case, I think you're using GraphQL SDL for that. And then what AppSync does, it generates a full CRUD GraphQL API for you. And as a quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert in AWS AppSync either. So if I'm saying anything wrong here on the screen, on the stream, feel free to correct me in the comments so that we can clarify things. But my understanding of AppSync is that if you use it in the most straightforward way, that's how it works. You define your models in GraphQL SDL, and you get a full-blown GraphQL CRUD API that actually works with a DynamoDB database. I think that's the native kind of database that you're getting when you're using it in the most straightforward way.
Right.
But one cool thing about AppSync is that you're also able to hook up more data sources than just the default one with DynamoDB. In fact, you can define your own custom resolvers for the GraphQL API that will be served with the same GraphQL endpoint. And to implement these resolvers, you can use Lambda functions. And that's exactly the approach that's taken for this tool that I want to show today. The tool is another GraphQL, Prisma generator. Prisma generator is something that you add to your Prisma schema. It looks like this. And we're all familiar, I think, with the default Prisma client JS generator that you typically put here in order to get the JavaScript and TypeScript client that allows you to send queries to your database. But the generator API is open to the public. Everybody can write their own generators and generate whatever they want from the Prisma schema, from the Prisma models. And in fact, we've talked about a couple of these use cases in the past, in the first episodes of What's New in Prisma. For example, there is a generator that generates a UML diagram for you so that you have a visual representation of your database schema. There is another one that generates or transforms your Prisma models, I think, into a JSON schema. And we also have one that generates individual API documentation for your Prisma client. So there are a ton of different use cases for this generator. And in this case, the use case that has been implemented is to generate the files that you need to deploy a GraphQL API that works with your own database. So it's not using the default one, not the one that you get natively from AWS, but instead you can hook up your own database with it. This tool was created by Sylvain. He's based in Australia. We actually invited him to join us on the stream here, but I think right now it's 3 a.m. for him. And I am not surprised that he's not accepted this invitation at this time. Maybe we can have him on in a future stream. And he works at a company called Travis. And I talked to him today, and he also said that PRs to Prisma-Appsync are very welcome at the moment.
Cool.
All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the demo and see what I've prepared already. So first, what I did, I set up a database that I want to use here on Heroku. It's a free database on the free tier. In fact, I just followed this tutorial that we've published on our Dev2 a couple of months ago, or actually a year ago. That walks through the process of setting up this database. So I now have this database ready for me that I'm going to use for this demo. And here I have my empty folder for my project that I'm going to use. I copied or prepared most of the code snippets here that I'm going to run today so that I don't have to do too much typing. So this is just setting up my NPM project and installing the Prisma CLI as a development dependency. With that in place, I'm running a yarn Prisma init to set up my Prisma project. So I'm starting really very much from scratch here today. And then I'm going ahead and pasting 2 models in here. So this is the very well-known user and post model that people probably are familiar with from our documentation, no surprises. And then in the .env file, I'm pasting 2 database URLs, the regular one and the shadow database URL. These are real databases that are hosted here on Heroku. I'm going to delete them after the stream, so I don't think anybody will have the time to do shenanigans with these right now, but these are the actual connection URLs that I'm using to connect to them. I also need to add the shadow database URL to my data source right here in order to make Prisma Migrate work, but that's really all I need. And actually, I have one connection open to the database here in Postico so that we can see that right now it's empty. And I'm now going to use the Prisma Migrate dev command that we've also seen already in Daniel's demo, create the tables. So this is now generating my migration files. I can see what kind of SQL is being executed. And once I'm doing that, I also see that the tables have been created. And now I don't need Postico anymore because from now on, I can use Prisma Studio, and that's a much nicer experience. So I'm actually using the desktop version. And let's see. And the schema that I have is this one. So here is Prisma Studio connecting to my Postgres database hosted on Heroku. And just to have some initial data, I'm going to add one record here, one user record. That's now part of in the database. All right, so far so good. This was all just plain Prisma stuff. We now have a database. We now have a very basic Prisma setup here. So let's do the interesting part where we are starting to configure the AppSync generator. And I tried it only this morning, and I'm really not an AWS expert. And I was able to just follow the documentation here and just like pretty much follow the steps and get everything working. So you can go ahead and check out the docs here if you want to do the same. As a quick overview also for the architecture that we're using here, I alluded to this very quickly before, but effectively we have this AWS AppSync GraphQL endpoint. This is sort of like a gateway that's accepting all GraphQL queries. And by default, as I mentioned, this goes to a Dynamo DB. In this case, it won't, because we are hooking it up to a custom AWS Lambda function, which in turn is going to use Prisma Client to talk to the Postgres database that's hosted on Heroku. So that's on a high level the stack that we are using. So for the installation, I'm first going to install the Prisma-Appsync generator. I'm just following the steps from here now. And next, I'm going to add this new generator to my Prisma schema as well. So now I have two generators, and both generators will be invoked in my project when I run yarn Prisma generate, which I'm doing now. So this generates the familiar Prisma client, but it now also generates the additional resources that are used for the Prisma-Appsync deployment. And in fact, what it does, it generated it into node modules. There is a command that copies it from node modules into the project root. So here is what we've got. We've got a CDK folder, and the CDK is a tool also provided by AWS that basically lets you manage your AWS deployments via a CLI and with the approach of infrastructure as code, basically. And I'll walk through the files, but first I want to run the actual deploy command, because the deploy command takes a little while, and so that we have something to do and not awkward deployment silence, I'll save this, the walkthrough through these files, and continue with the deployment for now. So I'm going into this CDK folder and install the dependencies in here. Then there is also another .n file, which needs the database URL from my database. And that was this one that I was using. So here we go. And I think that's the only .env that I need to set. And then the last thing that is left here is that I have to specify the binary targets on my Prisma client generator. And the reason for that is that we're deploying the Prisma client based application to AWS Lambda, which has a certain environment. And we need to tell Prisma client which for which kind of environment, for which platform the Rust-based query engine should be compiled. And that's what we are doing here by adding this additional binary target so that it's compatible with the AWS Lambda execution environment. And that's it. I can now run a CDK deploy. And it starts with the deployment process. Let's see that everything hopefully works as expected for now. Yes, so here it tells me what kind of resources it's going to create. And so this is now the point in time where I want to quickly show the files that were generated. And the most interesting one, I think, is this index.ts file, which contains all the resources. So literally AWS resources that I'm defining via a script. And this script is currently being executed, and all of these resources are being spawned up for me. So we have this GraphQL API that is being spawn up for me with a schema that's generated basically by the Appsync, by the Prisma-Appsync generator and inserted here. There are some kind of security-related resources. And then what's interesting is the node.js function. So this is my actual Lambda function that is going to be invoked whenever I send a GraphQL query or mutation to the Appsync GraphQL endpoint. And this Lambda function in turn, so this is called Lambda function. This is being used again here in the Lambda data source. And that's what I mentioned before, is that by default, you get the native AWS database, but you can also hook up other data sources to Appsync. And in this case, we are hooking up a new Lambda data source right here that's going to be invoked. And the code for that, for this particular Lambda data source, again, can be found. It should be in the, wait, isn't there a file called handler? Yes, here. This is the code for the handler function, and this Prisma-Appsync constructor or class that's being imported here is effectively, as Sylvain calls it, a Prisma client on steroids. So that's the component that's responsible to resolve the incoming GraphQL queries and mutations and invoke the Prisma client queries, the CRUD operations under the hood to resolve them. And that's pretty much the logic that's just happening here with parse event and resolve. So far, so good. Oh, I think I should have hit yes before. Okay. I saved all the talking, but I didn't confirm it.
That's okay.
So I think it'll probably take a couple of minutes again.
So what I'm seeing so far is that this, or at least what we'll see, because it's a GraphQL API with a database, etc., on Dynamo, or in your case Postgres, this is like a more configurable GraphQL. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, exactly. If you want to look at it that way, then I think that's certainly one perspective, where kind of GraphQL had a fairly simple way of configuring your models and then exposing that GraphQL CRUD API. There were some ways how you could extend that, but really Prisma-Appsync is a lot more powerful than GraphQL used to be. But yeah, the idea is very similar. And in this case, I don't even use these pre-generated CRUD operations, because I just use a custom data source, so to say, but I don't have to write any code for that myself, because that's exactly what's provided by the Prisma-Appsync generator.
Right. So what about this issue where, like, we've talked about this a lot. If you've got a database table of users, for example, and you don't want to expose the password field in like a query, do you have control over that? Like, you can pick and choose how your GraphQL schemas are going to operate?
You mean specifically with the Prisma-Appsync generator here?
I think so, because if I'm understanding correctly, this is going to generate GraphQL, a GraphQL schema from the database model, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
So do you have control over how the API gets configured beyond just like taking it one for one from the database model?
I think so. In fact, here was the folder that I was looking for before. So inside Prisma, we now see also all the stuff that was generated. And this is basically the GraphQL schema that the Prisma-Appsync generator generated for me. And I guess if I wanted to modify it, then I could go into it manually before I run CDK deploy, or with my next CDK deploy, I could just, like, for example, hide the views field here. And in that case, it also wouldn't be exposed anymore in GraphQL because it wouldn't even be deployed in the first place.
Right.
All right. So the deployment finished. So let me navigate to my AWS console. Let's see. I thought I was still logged in somewhere. Here we go. This is the Prisma-Appsync API that was just now created. I want to preface this with I did an initial run through this demo this morning. Everything worked. Then I did a dry run of the demo just before the stream, and then something didn't quite work out, and I believe it was a caching issue because I picked the same name, this Prisma-Appsync API, as the default name for the deployment. Let's see if it works now. But what we can see in any case is the GraphQL schema and all the queries, mutations, and subscriptions that are being generated for us. So we can just go to the docs here in GraphQL as we're used to, and we see the queries, we see the mutations, and we see the subscriptions.
Very
cool. I should be able to now list users by just name, ID, and email. And all right, it actually did work this time. Cool. So this is actually returning the database record from that Postgres database that's hosted on Heroku and connected to my AWS AppSync endpoint.
So if you wanted to then develop locally, like you're developing a front end, which is going to use consume this API, then you just need to point your GraphQL. When you create your GraphQL client, you would point it to that remote URL that you got there, right?
Exactly. I would point it to this one, and I would authenticate with this API key here.
Gotcha. Cool. That's awesome. Yeah. You know, it's definitely a quick way to get an API up.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see all the use cases that people find for these Prisma generators.
Yeah.
I guess this one is the most complex one that I've seen so far.
Yeah.
But it really goes to show the power of this approach, of this extensible generator system that we've built, and all the possibilities with it.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. Great demo. Thank you for the demo.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it. We can wrap. Oh, actually, let's very quickly plug a couple of things before we wrap up.
Yep.
So first, we had our Prisma meetup last week with really interesting talks. The talks have now been published on YouTube, so you can find them on the Prisma channel. Very, very interesting. And next week on Thursday, we have the enterprise event coming up. So if you're interested in using Prisma in an enterprise context and what it can do for you there, then definitely join us for the event. And with that, Ryan, let's wrap up, and I see you in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.